And I'm particularly glad that it continues to be important enough for people to come to events like this, because I have to tell you, you never really know when you walk into a room in this particular day and age to speak about race, whether folks are going to come, because every other voice in the culture is telling you that you don't need to be in a room like this, that you don't have to engage in any kind of a dialogue around race, because after all, we have transcended those issues. We have moved well beyond them, or even worse, if you're like me, you have the misfortune of getting emails regularly clogging up your inbox that remind you that you, by virtue of talking about the issue of race, are actually to blame for keeping the problem alive, right? Which is fascinating. I get these emails all the time, and you always know that they're especially unhinged because they're all capital letters. And they're in red font. Because I wouldn't have known that you hated me if you had taken the cap lock off. If you had left it in regular black font with small letters, I would never have been able to interpret the death threat or the invitation to injure myself in some particularly horrific way as an indication that perhaps you disagreed with me. So by sending me the all capital letter red font email, you make it clear, as if the words didn't. And the words say, of course, it's people like you, that keep racism alive. If you would just stop talking about it, it would go away. A logic that we would never apply to any other social problem on God's green earth. You wouldn't apply this logic to any other area, right? You wouldn't say, for instance, if I were to stand up here and say that I was going to give you a talk about world hunger, and I were to say to you that there are billions of children around the planet who are starving right now for lack of adequate nutrition, I doubt fairly seriously any of you would respond to that statement by standing up and saying, shh, my God, fool, don't talk about world hunger. If you talk about that, children are going to die. That's how that works, my God. On the other hand, if you would just be quiet, food would miraculously appear on the plates of all those starving children. No one would suggest that, because we would understand that in the face of real social problems, silence does not solve those problems. It's like blaming the speedometer for the speeding ticket that you got. The speedometer did not cause you to go 175. It was just a tool to demonstrate to you what you did. It's just an indicator of social truth. It's not the cause of the social truth, right? But you're being told we don't have to have the conversation, especially because since we have a man of color as president, not just elected once but twice, clearly the problem is behind us. A logic that, again, we would not apply in any other culture or society in a similar situation. So none of us in this room, I gather, would assume that patriarchy had been eradicated from, let's say, Pakistan, because Benazir Bhutto, a woman, was elected there not once but twice as the head of state. Now, she has since, of course, been assassinated, which indicates how some people loved her and felt about her there. But if I were to say to you that sexism had been wiped off the map of Pakistan, or for that matter, Israel, India, Great Britain, the Philippines, all of which, and several others, have had female heads of state, my guess is that we would understand the illogic of that. I have a 9-year-old daughter smart enough to know that makes no sense. If I were to say to her, hey, honey, you know what you really ought to do when you finish school, right, is just pack your bags and move to Karachi, because there you will have equal opportunity, even at the age of 9, knowing nothing about Karachi, not even where one might find that on a map. She would be insightful enough to say, no, Daddy, somehow I don't think that's true, right? Because we would understand that individual accomplishment, in this case of a woman as head of state in those countries, or in this country as a man of color vis-a-vis the issue of racism, that individual accomplishment doesn't really tell us very much about systemic reality. We can and we do have a man of color as president, and yet the fact remains that the typical white family in this country has 20 times the net worth of the typical black family in this country. The typical white family, right in the midpoint, the median, 20 times the net worth of the typical African-American family, 18 times that of the typical Latino family. And that isn't, of course, because, oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was perfectly loud. I'm so used to being told to not be so loud in my home that I'm so used to not needing the microphone. But 20 to 18 times to 1, the net worth of the typical black or Latino family. It's not because white folks have worked harder, obviously. It's not because we've prayed harder. I think we're clear on that. And it's certainly not because we possess some superior investment wisdom that people of color lack. If you've learned nothing from the last 5 to 6 years of global financial crisis, you can at least take this away, that a handful of rich white men can actually lose a lot of money, and they're capable of doing it with no help from black people, no help from Mexicans, be they be they documented or not. No Asian Americans, no indigenous native North American peoples, no Arab American folks, just a handful of the richest, smartest, highest SAT having white guys on Wall Street who have to be geniuses to lose $12.5 trillion of other people's money. That takes an incredible amount of skill. 20% of the net worth of the United States, which it took over 2 centuries to build up. It took them 18 months to wipe it out, right? But we still, of course, have the same stereotypes, right, about who the dangerous people are, right? So we're still more afraid of a black or brown male crossing the street wearing a hoodie than we are of rich white men driving around in their Lexuses or Lexi, whatever the proper plural form of a particular automobile might be. All right, so we know we have to have the conversation, irrespective of the presence of a man of color at the top of the political spectrum. We can have a man of color as president and still have, as the Labor Department tells us, our current reality where black folks with college degrees did everything right, stayed in school, got the paper that we say we're supposed to get in order to be deemed competent and worthy of good jobs, and yet black folks with college degrees almost twice as likely as whites with degrees to be unemployed. Latino folks with degrees about 50% more likely than comparable whites to be unemployed. Asian Americans with degrees about a third more likely than whites with degrees to be unemployed. So across the spectrum of color, folks of color have the same level of educational accomplishment, still struggling more in an economy where just about everyone is struggling, but some still more so than others, as has so long been the case in a society where black and Latino folks are 5 to 9 times more likely to be incarcerated for a drug possession offense than whites, even though all racial groups use illegal narcotics at roughly the exact same rate, suggests that individual accomplishment, leadership, the fact that there are people of color in very prominent positions doesn't tell us very much. So clearly we have to have the conversation. And yet, even when we do it, right, we don't do it often, we avoid it usually, but even when we do it, one of the challenges is doing it in a way that connects that issue of race to all the other issues, all the other isms and the oppressions and horrible injustices that we have to address in this country. And I myself have been guilty of compartmentalizing those. As someone who focuses mostly and principally on race, I, like others who focus mostly and principally on gender equity or sexuality equity, militarism, environment, all the different issues that are out there that confront us, sometimes we compartmentalize them, right? So the race folks are over here doing our work, and the folks who are fighting for LGBT liberation are over here doing their work, and the folks who are fighting for gender equity are over here doing their work, and we're not always talking to one another, and we're not connecting the threads that tie us together in this society as we move forward on the road towards social justice.
We exist in a world where the illusion of equality often masks the harsh reality of systemic inequality. It is a world where some are born with unearned advantages, while others are forced to navigate a treacherous landscape of systemic barriers. This video delves deep into the heart of this enduring issue, unmasking the invisible hand that shapes our lives, often imperceptibly, and revealing its profound impact on the black community and the broader landscape of communities of color. To illuminate this complex terrain, we turn to the incisive insights of Tim Wise, a renowned anti-racism educator and social commentator. Wise, a truth-teller in an era of obfuscation, has dedicated his life to exposing the uncomfortable realities of privilege and prejudice. He challenges us to transcend superficial observations and confront the systemic forces that perpetuate inequality. His work compels us to recognize that individual achievements, while commendable, do not negate the existence of systemic barriers that disproportionately hinder the progress of marginalized communities. This exploration is not merely an academic exercise. It is a journey into the lived experiences of millions. We will confront the uncomfortable truths of the racial wealth gap, a chasm born of historical injustices and sustained by contemporary biases. We will examine the deeply flawed systems of justice and education, institutions that, despite their purported impartiality, continue to perpetuate racial disparities. And we will delve into the psychological toll of systemic oppression, the insidious burden of internalized oppression and societal misrepresentation that weighs heavily upon communities of color. This analysis will not shy away from the hard data. We will scrutinize the statistics that reveal the stark realities of economic inequality, incarceration rates, and educational disparities. But we will also go beyond the numbers, exploring the human stories that lie beneath the surface. We will examine the historical context that has shaped these realities, tracing the roots of systemic inequality back to the legacies of slavery. We will also explore the contemporary manifestations of these biases, from implicit biases in hiring practices to the over-policing of black communities. Furthermore, we will explore the intersectionality of race with other forms of identity, recognizing that systemic inequality is not a monolithic experience. Black women, LGBTQ individuals, and those with disabilities face unique challenges that compound the burden of racial discrimination. We will also examine the environmental injustices that disproportionately affect Black communities, revealing the interconnectedness of social, economic, and environmental inequalities. This analysis is not intended to be a mere recitation of facts and figures. It is a call to action, a plea for a more just and equitable society. We will explore the policy changes, societal shifts, and community-led initiatives that are necessary to dismantle the structures of inequality. We will also confront the uncomfortable reality of white privilege, recognizing that acknowledging and dismantling this privilege is essential for creating a truly equitable society. We will embark on a journey that will challenge your assumptions, spark your curiosity, and, hopefully, inspire you to become an agent of change. We will confront the uncomfortable truths of systemic inequality, not to dwell in despair, but to illuminate the path towards a more just and equitable future. For in understanding the roots of inequality, we empower ourselves to dismantle them.
But every now and then, even as we fail to see the interconnectedness of oppressions and issues, occasionally something will happen in the news that demands our attention and that drives home some of these connections. And such a thing has happened in the course of the last 2 weeks. In fact, several things. And as I started to reflect on them, as I prepared for a talk the other day in Boston, I realized what some of those threads were and why it was important that I and all of us begin to speak of these things in maybe a slightly different way that will demonstrate the interconnectedness. Because after all, there are some common threads that tie together the tragedy in Boston, that act of terrorism, but also too many people's reaction to it, in the desire to rush to judgment about an entire community, to engage in rampant upticks and profiling of our Muslim brothers and sisters, our Arab brothers and sisters, or in this case, apparently Caucasian brothers and sisters who just so happen to be Muslim, which is fascinating. It's hard for the American mind to get its head around, right? How do you deal with really white, like white to the point where you're from the part of the world that gave white people our anthropological name? Like, I mean, this is hard for white people to get our heads around. Like, these are Caucasians, like more than any of us in this room who are white are Caucasians. But because they're Muslim, and since 9/11, Islam darkens, right? Since 9/11, Islam becomes a racialized religious tradition, a racialized cultural tradition, so that we can't quite make it out. And of course, we don't respond, do we, to white, self-professed Christian terrorists the way that we do those who are Muslim or, again, profess to be followers of Islam. And for those who haven't seen the piece that I wrote on this about a week ago, I have a list, actually, of 105 such white, self-professed Christian terrorists whose acts did not lead us as a people, as a society, or as individuals in that society to respond to all white, mostly men, some women, and self-professed Christians in the way that we have to the Tsarnaev brothers and others who may share their religious traditions. But it wasn't just the bombing and our reaction to it that I think is important for us to make some connections. There are some other things that have happened in the past few months. They may not seem connected, but I want to suggest there's a thread that links them. So you have the Boston tragedy and our overwrought, in some ways, reaction to it. You have the very same week, the explosion at the fertilizer plant in West Texas. You have the Steubenville rape trial just a few months ago in regard to a horrible sexual assault of an inebriated and essentially passed out young woman late summer, early fall, in which these two young men were sent away for what might end up being 2 years and were lamented as to their loss of promising football careers, they being portrayed as the victims rather than the young woman they assaulted. You have one after another governor in the last 4 and 5 and 6 months who have said they won't take federal money to expand Medicaid for the poor, even though that would save their states money by putting more of the health care burden on the federal government rather than the states. But for ideological reasons, they would rather not take that money to expand health care access to the poor. You have my state of Tennessee, where lawmakers have been on a special bandwagon of irrationality for the last couple of years, particularly this year, where you have a lawmaker who has, for the second year in a row, introduced, thankfully it did not pass, but introduced legislation that would essentially prohibit teachers, counselors, principals, school administrators at any level before high school of even saying the word gay, let alone actually seeking to address issues of straight supremacy and heterosexism and transphobia that begin, of course, well before the high school years. But if you're in middle school or elementary school, struggling not only with one's own sexual identity, but the society's reaction to it, and you're a counselor at that school, you can't help that young person. You can't even talk about the possibility that they might actually be lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered, except, as the bill says, to tell the parents that their child seems to be struggling so that the parents can handle it as they always do so splendidly. So what links these seemingly disparate issues together? A Don't Say Gay bill, an explosion of a fertilizer plant in West Texas, a terrorist attack in Boston, and our reaction to it, the Steubenville rape trial. I would suggest that the thing that links all of this together is an increasing and deepening mentality of disposability on the part of our nation, our culture, and maybe even our human species, but certainly in our own country we see it. The notion that certain people just don't count as much as others. That's the mentality that animates terrorism. So the fact that innocents will die so I can make my political statement doesn't bother me. Then the reaction to that, let's profile everybody that looks like them, sounds like them, prays like them, is a way of saying that they too, as a community, are disposable. When the owners of the fertilizer plant in West Texas don't have a safety inspection for almost 30 years and are in violation of numerous safety codes at one of their other plants, what they are saying is our workers are fundamentally disposable on behalf of our profits. We will put them after our own financial needs. Those young men who took the pictures of that young woman that they assaulted in Steubenville, Ohio, were saying that she is disposable, not just the picture that we took of her, which we can dispose of with the click of a button on our phone, but she herself. And women generally do not count. And when the courts treat rapists with the kinds of kid glove reaction that we too often do, we're saying that as a larger culture. When the governors and lawmakers in state after state say they don't want to expand Medicaid for the poor, even though that will leave millions bereft of health care, they are saying, in effect, these are disposable people. When that lawmaker in Tennessee and his acolytes and supporters say you can't say gay in a school, what we're saying is that our LGBT brothers and sisters don't count. That if they decide in the face of intense bullying to take their lives and there's no one there to help them, that isn't our problem. This mentality of disposability links a few other things as well. It links together hate crimes. It links together the impulse to war and nationalism, religious bigotry of all types. It certainly links together the attacks on poor folks. Generally, it's what leads politicians who are seeking high office to actually say with no sense of shame or irony that there's roughly half of the American population that just don't want to work. They are takers and not makers, and thus we ought not really concern ourselves with them. It's the mentality of disposability at work there that says these people fundamentally don't count like you and me. It's the mentality that allows us to incarcerate 2.25 to 2.5 million individuals disproportionately for nonviolent offenses, not really caring about if or when or how they might be rehabilitated for whatever criminal act they are in fact guilty of, and doesn't really care if those persons of color with regard to the war on drugs are disposed of in this way at rates that are 5 to 9 times higher than those for white folks. It's the mentality of disposability that allows us to construct a school system that is profoundly unequal and quite deliberately so. And I know it's hard for us to hear that because we like to think that when inequality besets our society that it's just because we don't quite understand how to get to equality. You know, we're trying, but we just haven't quite figured out the trick. And yet really that's not true. With regard to schools, our inequality in our school system is quite deliberate. We know that. How? Because we brag about it. We brag about the fact that we have thousands of school districts all doing their own thing, right? Because God forbid we wouldn't want to have big government involved in education. We don't want big government controlling the schools. We don't want big government setting national standards. We don't want big government requiring a certain degree of similarity in teacher training. We don't want big government requiring equitable distribution of financial resources, so we rely on property taxes, right, for most of the funding that goes into our schools around the country, even though we know by definition that will result in unequal educational resources. So we have unequal resources, unequal teacher training, unequal and unstandardized curriculum, and then at the end of the 12 years, we give all the kids a standardized test. After we've given them 12 years of unstandardized education, and we call that fairness, but we can only do that because we have at some point decided that the ones who fall through the cracks, the ones whom we leave behind in spite of our fancy language that we use in our education bills that say we won't leave any children behind, we know that ultimately what we're saying is they don't count. If they don't make it, that's all right, because someone has to do the really hard work that the rest of us think we're too good for, right? Somebody has to clean the bedpans at the hospital. Somebody has to pick up the garbage on Wednesdays in my neighborhood. Somebody has to change the sheets at the Westin where I stayed last night. And if everybody goes to college, who's going to do that? You see, if everybody goes to college, those people might think that they're above that kind of work because those of us with degrees, we've decided we are, right? Like, I don't even know how to, and think about how absurd it is, because the people that pick up my garbage every Wednesday, the 3 guys that do that, right? The work that they perform is far more valuable than the work that the pharmaceutical sales rep 2 doors down who hawks Viagra, right? The guys that pick up the garbage are performing a much more important social purpose. I'm not saying there might not be a social purpose to both. I'm just saying, right, that the guys that pick up the garbage ultimately are the ones, like if they don't show up for 5 weeks, we have bubonic plague on my block. Like people start falling out dead, right? Because I wouldn't know where to take my garbage. I don't know where the dump is. I don't know where the recycle facility is. So if those guys go on strike, my community is completely screwed, right? That they get paid about $21,000 a year. The sales rep down the block makes high 6 figures, right? If he doesn't show up for 5 weeks, life will go on, right? Somebody else will sell the drugs that he sells. Folks will continue to take the drugs that he sells, and everyone will go about their business. It won't have the same effect, but he makes far more money. So it isn't about social utility. It's just about the fact that we have an economy predicated on inequality, so we create a school system that recreates that says some will be here and some will be there, and to some extent, that's the system that we have had for a very long time and that we still have. All of it, I think, just like ecological and environmental destruction, predicated on the idea that some simply don't count as much as others. Right now, I'm working on a book that will be released in the fall that really goes into this in some detail, particularly vis-a-vis the way that we view the poor. And it's particularly important that I preview this for you just for a second, because I think it tells us a little bit about how those of us who fight for social justice are going to have to recast the narrative in order to move things in an opposite direction. The name of the book that will be released in the fall is called The Culture of Cruelty, and the subtitle of that is How America's Elites Demonize the Poor, Valorize the Rich, and Jeopardize the Future. And fundamentally, what I'm arguing in that book, based on the research that I've been doing on it for some time, and I've written a little bit about this in essay form on my website and elsewhere, is that we are very interestingly, even as we move forward as a society in a whole lot of ways, even as we make progress in a whole lot of ways, some of it around racial equity, sure, some of it around gender equity, some of it around equity for our LGBT brothers and sisters, and yet even as we do that, there is this very interesting countervailing trend toward a deepening culture of disposability and cruelty toward those who are the least among us economically. And it's fascinating because it wasn't always this way. Like if you look at the historical way in which Americans spoke of the poor, other than those at the very pinnacle of society who always spoke badly of them, who always had the mentality of Ebenezer Scrooge, right, in the Dickens story, Christmas Carol, right, the idea that, well, what, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses, right? That was the famous line when folks came and asked Scrooge for charity. What, charity? Why can't you just lock them up and make them work? Of course, when Dickens wrote that character in the second third of the 19th century, he realized that Scrooge was the jerk. Like, he understood he was not a Dickensian hero. He was the heel. Oddly enough, we are now a society where that kind of mentality is absolutely normative. You'll hear that uttered, that same kind of argument, from people who want to be president of the United States and vice president of the United States. All right? People who will actually say the reason they got into politics is because they read The Fountainhead, for God's sake, and Atlas Shrugged, right? Like if you got into public service because of Ayn Rand, right? God help you. First, it's just the most awful literature ever put down on paper. But more to the point, like you didn't even understand Ayn Rand because she didn't believe in public service. So why you would join public service, it's like a complete contradiction, but whatever. This is someone who said, if you've read The Fountainhead, I'm sorry. If you've read Atlas Shrugged, I'm sorry. If you're familiar with objectivism as a political philosophy, and I put that in quotes because it's stretching the term to its limit, but right, this is a woman who actually said it wasn't just she didn't believe in big government, she didn't believe in charity. Right? She actually said charity and altruism as a premise was evil. And people who gave of themselves without something benefiting them were actually not just suckers, but were evil people, right? Who deserved to be ridiculed and scorned, right? And that book and the people who venerate that book making this huge comeback. It sold more copies 3 years ago than it had sold in the previous decade, right? All of a sudden, this mentality that we have the takers and the makers and never shall the two meet, and the one is worthy of denigration and the other valorization is becoming very deeply embedded, even though, like I said, it wasn't always that way. Go back 70 years, 80 years. Right? Go back to the days of the Great Depression, and what you find very interesting was there was a time when the vast majority of just average everyday folks in this country, didn't have that mentality. They had an understanding that if you were out of work, if you were poor, if you were struggling, it wasn't because of your character flaw. It wasn't because there was something wrong with you. It was because there were systemic and institutional factors beyond your control that were affecting you. Now, really rich people didn't buy that. They thought it was character flaw. They thought it was people were lazy. They still judged those at the bottom. But for the most part, average everyday folks did not. Now, of course, there was a huge racialized difference there. Certainly during the Depression, we know that most of the New Deal programs, for instance, were targeted toward the white poor and the white struggling. People of color routinely locked out of them, right? So we understand it wasn't racially equitable, but, people were venerated for riding the rails looking for work. The hobo was a venerated character, right? You read the literature of that time, of Mice and Men and Grapes of Wrath. These were not people who were being beat up for their condition, right? Woody Guthrie was writing songs about people who today would be looked at as bums, right? Woody Guthrie himself would be shot were he writing songs today, valorizing those at the bottom. So we were a culture that understood there were these institutional issues to which we as a people had to respond. But something has happened, right? Something has happened in the intervening decades between then and now that has made us far less willing to, first of all, believe what we used to know was true, which is that there are systemic truths beyond our individual control about which we as a people need to respond, but also that have made it increasingly possible to speak of the poor not just as people who use up too many government resources. That's the rather benign version of this, right? But as people who are barely human at all. People who were essentially animalized by right-wing folks in the media, animalized, dehumanized by politicians seeking our votes, people who were viewed as unworthy of respect. Anytime, and I document this fully in the book, you can turn on the television or the radio and hear folks actually saying that there should be shame and humiliation in receiving government benefits. Right? That people should be so embarrassed, right? That we need to bring back regular food stamps rather than the EBT cards because the EBT cards are too normal, right? It almost makes it seem like you've got an actual debit card, like you might actually have a bank account, like you might actually be a normal American. And so there's not as much stigma. And we should drug test everybody who receives any form of government assistance, except, of course, being on payroll as a congressperson. Then I guess we're not going to do that. Or receiving some type of corporate subsidy for your company so you can promote your products overseas. I don't think they're going to drug test the corporate CEOs who benefit from that. But if you're on the bottom, we want to drug test you, we want to shame you, we want to humiliate you, or if you work at the Heritage Foundation, we want to put out a report every year that says you're not really that poor anyway because you got a television. Right? You're not really poor because you have a refrigerator. They literally put these reports out that say, the poor by today's standards are completely rich by the standards of the 19th century. Well, what kind of argument is that? I mean, even the most decrepit pauper in colonial Williamsburg had it all over Cro-Magnon, man. But what does that mean? Thomas Jefferson didn't have indoor plumbing. He used chamber pots. But I really don't think that we want to suggest that the fact that the poor in 2013 have indoor plumbing means they have nothing to complain about vis-a-vis even one of the founding fathers of our country. Right? This kind of relativism, this historical revisionism is really fascinating, and you have to ask yourself why it's happened. I do that in the book, and I think the answer to why that's happened is instructive about what we who believe and fight for social justice are going to have to do in the coming years to change the trajectory of the country. There are really three things, I think, that have contributed to this coarsening of our dialogue and our understanding of poverty and unemployment, right? This deepening culture of cruelty. The first is indeed race and racism, right? The fact that in the 30s, those in need were typified and represented in media and politics as white. Right? That's why those programs were popular, because the only folks who could really benefit from them, by and large, were white folks. It was precisely that moment where people of color started to gain access to the very programs that white folks had already had access to for 30 years, that they became unpopular. So as soon as those in need, those benefiting from government programs came to be seen, rightly or not, as being people of color, then our forbearance for those in need considerably dwindled. And there's a lot of research on this before my own book, Martin Gillen's book, Why Americans Hate Welfare, Jill Quadagno's book, The Color of Welfare, and others have looked at that and have seen a straight line relationship between the increasing representation of the poor as black and brown and the increasing hostility to the poor and the programs that benefit them. The second of these contributing factors is the feminization of poverty, about which many scholars have written. So sexism is also part of it, because in the 30s and the 40s, who were the folks who were looked at as those in need? They were the hardworking salt of the earth man, father, heterosexual provider of the family, right, who was out there looking for work against all odds, right, out there in the Dust Bowl Midwest during the Dust Bowl days and the droughts the 1930s. And so in that regard, it was very easy to say, we've got to support those men. In fact, that was the rhetoric in Congress when they set up cash welfare in the ADC program in 1935 as part of the Social Security Act. The actual rhetoric on the floor of Congress was that we needed to be able to provide cash to these women who were widowed or whose husbands had left to find work, so that those women could stay at home and raise their children without having to sell their labor power in the workforce. Now, putting aside the sexist element of that, right, the idea that women should just be at home and that's it, think about how that rhetoric has changed. That's not the rhetoric now, because now it's brown women. Now it's black women. Now it's what we started in the 70s calling ghetto matriarchs. My God, they're the arbiters of all social decay. So now the rhetoric has changed as poverty has been racialized, as it's been feminized, and now we actually view these women as the incubators of social dysfunction, right? By having, quote unquote, too many babies they can't afford, as if these women have babies on their own with no help from men, right? Right. There's a lot of other problems with that whole narrative, aside from the fact that it isn't really very accurate, that poor women, in fact, don't have statistically, in most cases, a significantly greater number of children than those who are not poor and those who receive government assistance. There's no statistically significant difference in the rates at which they have children versus the rates at which non-recipients have children. But that myth persists, and the racialization and the feminization of poverty is part of it. And there's one more thing that hasn't been explored as much and that I explore in the book because I think it's really relevant for our response, right? Now think about the one thing that has always been the background noise of our culture, right? It's that notion that if you work hard enough, you can make it. It's that notion of individualism, the myth of meritocracy. All you got to do is work hard, everything will be all right. And to some extent, even those of us who know that there are flaws in that rhetoric, because we all know people who've worked hard every day, never got anywhere, and we know plenty of folks born on third base think seriously that they hit a triple and have never had to work that hard in their entire lives, but think that they've earned where they are. So we know that the notion of meritocracy and individualism's never been as true as we sold it, but it's still there. It's still the background noise. It's what we've all been told. Now, take that notion, which is so popular and has been for so long, and add to it a popular culture like the one we have now. A popular culture in which you can turn on television any day of the week, 200 to 300 different channels, half of them in HD, all of them running reality shows, where, to be perfectly honest, not at all cruel, just being honest, that relatively mediocre, average, everyday, not all that extraordinary, not all that educated, not all that hardworking, not all that brilliant people have somehow been able to make it really big, right? I mean, you know, bottom line sort of is, if Honey Boo Boo has a show, and she does, and her family's perfectly lovely. I'm sure they're nice people. I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just saying they're not extraordinary. They're just average, everyday people. But they've got a gimmick. And in a society that tells you all you got to have is a gimmick or hard work, and you can make it, look, Honey Boo Boo made it, look. Real Housewives of the whatever, 90% of them are just incredibly dysfunctional, right? Both their relationships, their families, their kids. I mean, the whole thing is just a hot mess. That's why we watch it. Right? We wouldn't actually watch a show about actual housewives doing actual things that people do on a day-to-day basis. That would be incredibly boring. Like, nobody would watch that, right? It's only because they lead completely non-real lives, but they're lives that are aspirational in a country that's based on that notion that all you got to do is work hard. So if you can put up a YouTube video of your kid playing guitar, and next thing you know, he's Justin Bieber, right? So in a culture that already says everybody can make it, to then be able to look and see rather average, somewhat mediocre people making it only reinforces that notion, right? That's why, for instance, right now, even as the data tells us that upward mobility is less common now than at any point in recorded American history. So it's less true now than 50 years ago, for instance, that you can go from the bottom to the top or even the middle to the top. Upward mobility has declined, and yet the faith of the American people in upward mobility is at an all-time high. How do you explain that? How do you explain people being more confident that all they got to do is work hard and they can make it, and the data that says that's absolutely not true? I can't think of any reason except the way that popular culture has led us to perceive reality one way, even when our lives every day are telling us it's something different. What does this mean for us? I want to leave you with a few thoughts on that and take questions for the few minutes we have left. Seems to me that what this tells us is that we have to do two things. Number one is that we have to reclaim a moral and ethical narrative around fighting inequality, that we have to make inequality itself not only something that isn't normalized, but is something that is seen as fundamentally corrosive, not only to the economic health of the society, but the moral and ethical health. The way in which the right, for so many years, was able to hold sway over American politics was not, after all, with facts and figures and tight economic analysis. It was with a moral and ethical claim that they were righteous and everybody else was not, that they they were to sort of paraphrase and use the wonderful sermon today that I told Ed was fantastic, and he joked with me outside that it was going to change my life. And I don't know whether it changed my life, but it changed my talk, so that's good enough, right? It was incredibly powerful. But that separation between the sacred and the profane that the right has been able to use to say this is what is sacred and this is what is profane. Well, if anything is profane, if anything is something about which we should be offended, inequality has to rank up there at the top of that list. So we have to reclaim a moral and ethical narrative and take that back from those who for so long have hijacked it. And then we also have got to spin a narrative, not even spin because that has a negative connotation. We have to develop a narrative of solidarity, because one of the things that we're starting to realize as this culture of cruelty deepens is that a lot of the people who never gave it any thought when they were bashing the poor, when they were bashing those folks of color who they saw as being the ones who were so dependent on the government, now that they're out of work, right? Now that they need unemployment benefits, now that their house is in foreclosure, now that they can't afford health care for their families, now that they can't afford college for their kids because inflation for college enrollment is and for admission, for enrollment has gone up so much in terms of the cost of higher education. Now they're starting to realize and reap the whirlwind of the rhetoric that they sowed, right? There's a Newsweek column from 2 years ago, April of 2011, front page cover story about how all these white CEOs, white male CEOs and CFOs and CIOs and whatever other COs we've created to justify inflated salaries. We've done a lot of them, right? There's always a C something O of something, right? Now that they're out of work, this article says it's really a crisis now. Wasn't a crisis when it was just working class people losing their jobs when the manufacturing economy collapsed. It wasn't a crisis when it was 42% black teenage unemployment, which has been the case since the early 90s. But now that these affluent, highly educated white men are finding it hard to find a job, my God, it's really a problem. And they interviewed this one guy in there, and he actually made this comment. He said, when I'm out looking for work, I've been out of work for 26 weeks, 36, whatever it was. He said, when I'm out looking for a job, I feel like there's a neon sign around my neck that says unemployed bum. And I thought to myself when I read it, where'd you get that idea that unemployed people were bums? Because I got news for you. I know you didn't get it from other unemployed people. I know you didn't get that narrative from black people and from Latino folks and from poor people of any color. You know where you got that narrative? You, my friend, you created that narrative. You and folks like you, when you would pass the unemployment line or the food stamp office line and you'd tell people to get a job, right? That narrative that was created by those who thought that their privilege would always get them through. And 99 times out of 100 it does. 364 days out of 365 it does. But if that day 365 is the day you get that pink slip because you've been laid off and you didn't think it would ever happen to you, or it's the day that you can't pay your mortgage and the bank calls the note in, right? Then all of a sudden the other 364 don't matter. That narrative also has to be part of ours. That idea that, in fact, we are our brother and sister's keeper, and that what happens on that side of town in one decade is going to happen on your side of town 10 years or 15 years later if you don't do something about it. That combination of an ethical and also a practical, solidarity-based narrative is the only hope that we have. And I hope that as we go forward, we demand a reclamation of that narrative for the common good. Thank you all so much for being here today. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Tim. There are people with a microphone up. Please raise your hand. We only have time for 3 minutes, so there's one. George, start, please.
As an older white Tennessean to a younger white Tennessean, I want to say that you are an incredible teacher.
Thank you.
An incredible teacher.
Thank you.
Yes, could you comment on Jerry Brown's plan to redistribute funding to lower economic schools? And this morning, reading about Point Dunes School in Malibu that wants to secede because parents don't want their funds redistributed?
Right. Well, I think it speaks to the way in which our educational system has been so, the inequalities of it have been so taken for granted that any suggestion that we ought to have, first of all, a common school system at all, in which all are educated equitably, is just not on anyone's agenda. And that when it is proposed that we distribute from those who have excess resources to those who don't, this is the kind of thing that happens. And those parents, many of them in Malibu, I have no doubt, vote the right way, whatever we take that to mean. They're probably many of them quite progressive and probably, have D's next to their name when they go into the voting booth and they vote for the person who's, in their opinion, more liberal on 20 different issues. But when it comes to actually having to pony up to recognize that we rise or fall together, that's when the rubber really meets the road and people pull back. There's a great book I'd recommend called Divided Classes. Brantliner is the author, and I can't remember her first name, but it talks about the way that affluent parents have jockeyed and positioned to maintain that influence and that advantage, even as they profess liberalism and progressivism. So that's a significant problem.
Last question here.
Yeah.
My question is basically, you're talking about economics being a very key factor in many of these situations. But now we're in the era of multinationals. So it's not just the United States, but a corporation, especially the big banks who control the money, these are international things. How do you reconcile or not reconcile, but how do you incorporate or engage those kinds of people?
Right. Well, I don't know how we engage them, but I do think that we have to have a movement to rein in their power. I mean, ultimately, the only way in which we're going to solve problems, whether it's immigration flows that people want to make into a problem even when they're not, or whether it's economic dislocation for those at the bottom of the income scale, is to make sure that there's some global regulation of labor standards. There has got to be global regulation of both environmental protection, but also labor rights and rights to organize, a minimum wage pegged to the local GDP, so that there is not the ability of a company, for instance, to simply shift production so as to take advantage of lower wages and lack of regulation. Once that advantage, that ability to pit one worker against the other, or one country against the other, is diminished by way of regulation that we have got to push for and fight for, then we'll begin to see more equitable outcomes, not only for those north of the border, so to speak, but those south of the border in the global south as well. That becomes the work that we have to connect to folks in the so-called developing world, really overexploited world, who are already doing that work, who are fighting that fight, but desperately need us to show up to fight for them, because by fighting for them against that type of corporate and bank and financial exploitation, we fight for ourselves and we fight for the working people of this country too. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
We'll have Tim Wise back. He is the godfather of one of our children here, and he has to come and pay attention to one of our youth. Thank you, Tim. It was magnificent.
Tim Wise's incisive analysis of privilege and prejudice unveils a fundamental truth. Despite the rhetoric of progress, systemic inequality persists, casting a long shadow over the black community and other communities of color. This disparity, deeply embedded within the fabric of our institutions, demands a profound and nuanced understanding that transcends superficial observations. To truly grasp its implications, we must meticulously examine the historical and ongoing forces that perpetuate this inequity. At the heart of this systemic imbalance lies the stark reality of the racial wealth gap. Data meticulously compiled from sources like the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances vividly illustrates the profound disparity in net worth between white and black families. This chasm is not a mere accident of circumstance, but the direct consequence of historical and contemporary discriminatory practices that have systematically hindered black Americans' ability to accumulate wealth. Centuries of enslavement, followed by the oppressive regimes of Jim Crow laws and redlining, deliberately denied black individuals access to the fundamental building blocks of economic security: homeownership, quality education, and equitable employment opportunities. Even in the present day, insidious forms of discrimination persist in housing markets, lending practices, and employment sectors, perpetuating a cycle of disadvantage that spans generations. This economic chasm is not merely a matter of individual fortune, it is a direct result of systemic barriers meticulously crafted to maintain a racial hierarchy. Furthermore, the criminal justice and education systems stand as stark testaments to the enduring legacy of institutionalized bias. Disproportionate incarceration rates, as highlighted by Wise and corroborated by data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, expose the racial biases deeply embedded within the justice system. Factors such as racial profiling, harsher sentencing for comparable offenses, and unequal access to competent legal representation contribute to the disproportionate representation of black Americans in prisons. This over-incarceration not only strips individuals of their liberty, but also destabilizes families and communities, exacerbating economic hardship and perpetuating a cycle of disadvantage. Similarly, the education system, heavily reliant on property taxes for funding, creates vast disparities in resources between predominantly white, affluent school districts and predominantly black, low-income districts. This inequity in educational opportunities perpetuates a cycle of poverty, limiting the potential of countless individuals and denying them the tools necessary to achieve economic mobility. The compounding effect of these systems is devastating. The over-incarceration of black individuals removes productive members from their communities, further straining already fragile economic structures, which in turn hinders the ability of these communities to adequately fund schools and other vital social services. Beyond the tangible economic and institutional barriers, systemic inequality inflicts a profound psychological toll. Constant exposure to negative stereotypes and discriminatory experiences can lead to internalized oppression, wherein individuals internalize and believe the negative messages about their own race. Media portrayals and societal narratives often reinforce these stereotypes, contributing to prejudice and discrimination. The shifting societal perception of poverty, from a time of relative empathy to one of scorn, as Wise observes, is further amplified when the face of poverty is a person of color. This shift in narrative reflects a broader societal tendency to blame individuals for their circumstances, rather than addressing the systemic factors that contribute to their plight. This blame, coupled with the constant stream of negative representation, creates a mental burden for the community that is hard to quantify. The digital age, while offering avenues for connection and information sharing, also presents new challenges in the fight against systemic inequality. Social media platforms, while capable of amplifying marginalized voices, can also become breeding grounds for the rapid dissemination of misinformation and hate speech. Algorithms, often designed without considering racial bias, can perpetuate existing inequalities by prioritizing content that reinforces dominant narratives. This underscores the need for digital literacy and critical engagement with online platforms, as well as the development of ethical guidelines for technology companies. Moreover, the intersectionality of race with other forms of identity, such as gender, sexuality, and disability, further complicates the landscape of systemic inequality. Black women, for instance, face unique challenges stemming from both racism and sexism, leading to disparities in areas such as healthcare, employment, and political representation. Black LGBTQ+ individuals experience discrimination based on both their race and sexual orientation or gender identity, facing heightened risks of violence and marginalization. Recognizing and addressing these intersecting forms of oppression is essential for creating a truly inclusive and equitable society. The effects of environmental racism also contribute to the systemic burdens placed on black communities. Frequently polluting industries and hazardous waste sites are located in predominantly black neighborhoods, leading to disproportionate exposure to environmental toxins and adverse health outcomes. This environmental injustice further exacerbates existing health disparities and underscores the need for environmental policies that prioritize equity and justice. Addressing systemic inequality requires a multifaceted and sustained effort that tackles both the root causes and the ongoing manifestations of discrimination. Policy changes that promote equitable access to housing, education, and employment are essential. Criminal justice reform is also crucial to dismantle the racial biases embedded within the system, including addressing racial profiling, sentencing disparities, and the over-policing of black communities. Shifting societal narratives through education, dialogue, and media representation is vital to challenge negative stereotypes and promote positive and accurate portrayals of black people and other communities of color. Supporting community-led initiatives that address the specific needs of marginalized communities is equally important. Empowering communities to advocate for their own rights and needs is essential for creating lasting and meaningful change. This includes investing in community-based programs that provide resources and support to address the unique challenges faced by black communities. Furthermore, a critical component of dismantling systemic inequality is acknowledging and addressing the role of white privilege. White privilege, often invisible to those who possess it, grants unearned advantages and opportunities based solely on race. Recognizing and acknowledging this privilege is the first step towards dismantling the systems that perpetuate it. This requires engaging in difficult conversations about race and privilege, challenging implicit biases, and actively working to create a more equitable society. In conclusion, the legacy of systemic inequality continues to cast a long and pervasive shadow over the black community. By acknowledging the historical and ongoing forces that perpetuate these disparities, and by committing to meaningful and sustained change, we can work towards a more just and equitable society. This requires not only policy reform but also a fundamental shift in societal attitudes and a commitment to dismantling the structures that perpetuate inequality. Only then can we truly realize the promise of a society where opportunity is not determined by the color of one's skin, and where the weight of history no longer burdens the pursuit of a just and equitable future.